Hello. I'm here with Savvy. I'm
Hey
Ravyn,
guys.
and we're going to be doing a little bit of a workshop, describing a little bit what goes into making a Rivals Workshop character and how you could go about doing that yourself. So as a basic introduction, I'm Ravyn, the sole programmer of Team Nerve. Some of our creations you might have seen. We created Fox and Falco, Hodan, 2B, and most recently Pokemon Stadium. Uh, So I'm just going to start us off with what separates a Smash character from a Rivals character, because fundamentally they seem similar, right? Like they, oops, my bad. They both start with uh, three specials, four, my bad. Five aerials. It seems pretty similar, but I think the distinctive thing that goes into a Rivals character that can really separate it is that their specials really feel special. Their kit interacts with itself. It's not just random moves. Like no special in a Rivals character you could ever put on a normal. And I think they do that in a lot of ways. And one of the major ways that they do it is a little bit of stage control, or at least an element that interacts with the stage. You'll note if you go through the entire Rivals cast, you'll note that each of them have this in at least some sort of way. There's some worse examples like Shovel Knight. You have to buy his stage control item, but the rest of the characters, they all have something. Like Zetaburn has that fire pool, Clarin has that plasma field. They all have something that can interact with the stage. And furthermore, another important thing, and this one more interacts with balance than anything, is that all of them use, or at least all of their kits interact with the universal mechanic of parrying exceptionally well. You'll note with Rano, who puts poison on his enemies, if you parry that poison needle, or any of his attacks really, you lose all of the poison that's on you. Things like that they love to do in this game so that they can make mechanics that stack on top of each other, and they can make mechanics that grow into a greater character, but then have ways to combat that work universally with every character. And that's what I mean by a cohesive kit, right? A kit that's thought out, a kit with mechanics and ideas that interact with itself and with the opponent. And so we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about that here. What do I mean by specials that interact with each other? Well, here on the right, I'm showing maybe my favorite example of this. Craig can pull out a rock at any time, and if he throws that rock and places it, it's there. It's a stage control. It's just on the stage. He can pick it back up, or his opponents can hit it. However, he also has another move, his side B, which basically puts him into a little ball and he rolls forward. If he hits an opponent at any point, he can jump cancel after that. However, another interesting thing that he can do is if he hits his rock, he can also jump cancel that. So you look at that. All these kinds of things are all over Rivals of Aether. Moves that interact with each other in a really brilliant way without taking away or adding extra bloat to the move. Like you can just use that rock like a normal projectile if you want, or you could set it up on the stage to give yourself a point where you can side B safely because you can just hit the rock and jump cancel it. And two, I think another important thing that rivals characters do is interacting with both characters, right? Not just one character is able to interact with this. Like Craig's rock, again, wonderful example. The opponent can hit it, and if the opponent hits that rock, it breaks and splinters and can hurt Craig, just like Craig can use it for himself. That is seen very frequently. Things that both players can interact with in a really fun and interesting way. Even stuff like Clarin Field, which seems very Clarin-sided, right? It builds up a bit of it's a field, and projectiles, if they hit or are in the field, they just disappear. There's still a level of interactability there because it adds an interesting section of the stage that you have to plan around, right? It changes your game plan for both players, which can lead to a really interesting dynamic. And then furthermore, however, now getting more into the workshop side of things, I love when new people getting into the workshop see all these wonderful ideas that Basecast does, and like, oh well, I want to do this, and I really gotta emphasize, just because Basecast does it doesn't necessarily mean that you can, right? Because everything has an upside and a downside. Like the wonderful example I put here is Rano Tongue on Ori. If you don't know what that means, Rano Tongue is this ability that Rano can do that sends out an extremely long, I guess not really a projectile, his tongue extends. And if it hits you, he grabs you and puts you into a little bit of a bubble. Furthermore, another interesting thing that he can do with it is if he jumps in the air and Rano Tongue hits the ground, he can launch himself forward. Now that's really useful in Rano because Rano doesn't have range, or sorry, he has range, absolutely. He doesn't have speed, right? In the air, he's one of the slowest rivals in the game. He just can't move that fast. This is compensated for things like this, moves that can launch you with burst movement, or even moves like his regular moves are all really large in range. This is because he can afford that. But if you put that on a character like Ori, who has one of the fastest airspeeds in the game, it just wouldn't make a lot of sense, would it? Because sure, Basecast does have this really long tongue hitbox, but consider the character that it's put on. Rivals is really, really smart about being careful and planning the characters and the elements that go into these characters. Every amazing move that a character has comes with a very inherent downside. And when I say that, I don't mean something like, oh, well, I gave this character an F smash that kill, or an F strong rather, that kills at 20%, but I made the recovery weak. That's not what I mean by a downside. I mean a downside that directly relates to the move itself. Like I said, Reno has extreme range, but he has slow airspeed. So in reality, somebody like Ori, whose range isn't as good, ends up having around the same threat bubble, which threat bubble is basically a term for where can you place a hitbox nearby you in the next couple of frames. So you look at somebody like Rano, he has this like really horizontal threat bubble for him because he can jump up and use his normals, but then it doesn't. Very like rectangular, but then it doesn't go very far because he can't move very far. But then somebody like Ori, who's is much more, angular, Ori can go super far in one direction, and put out their normals, and so it ends up being a bit of a wider but less tall threat bubble. The point is, characters that have wildly different stats can end up having similar threat bubbles just because it's balanced well. Like Rano, despite not being able to move far, has increased range around the same threat bubble as Ori, despite not being able to move as fast. You always got to think about those kind of things when you're making a move. Think about, does it fit on the character, or is it just a cool idea for a move? So another thing that I want to talk about is the importance of readability in balance. In this little example here, I've shown all of Maple's aerials. This is the very first frame that comes out. I've chosen Maple on purpose because Maple is a very fast character whose normals come out quite fast, and just in general, Maple's the fastest character in the game. So Maple, of all characters, it's incredibly important for all of their moves to be readable. So you can see here the nairs in the middle, forward air, back air. The only two that are kind of similar here are back air and down air. And I'll concede they are quite similar. But at the very least, they do have a different facial expression. The point of this is to show that you should always, make sure that the startup frames in your moves, exactly and immediately what move's about to come out. You can look at Maple here and use, especially that fair. You're like, oh, okay, a fair is about to come out, and they do this tell by placing the leaf blades in distinctly different positions for all of the normals, so you know which normal is about to come out if you can see that green immediately. And that's where I want to talk about the 13 frame human reaction time. That's not a true number, right? It not only is it just depends on the person, but it's also like kind of a buzzword because it's just like, well, sure, 13 frames for like your reaction time maybe, but then there's controller polling and delay on the monitor, and and like in all these aspects that get into there. 13 frames is not really an accurate number, and it changes. But the point of that is, you could look at a move having anywhere between 13 to 20. If a move has any more startup frames than like 20, you can react to that. You can safely parry that. So if you want to balance a move like that, you can make it extremely strong. Put a bunch of startup frames on that, and then you could safely parry that. That's not usually my favorite way to balance a move, but it's done in Basecast. Craig's F strong has a very high startup that is reactable, stuff like that, and then he compensates that again, talking about the previous aspect, by making it push you forward and having a lot of range, despite being reactable. So anyway, just make sure when you're designing a move, make sure that your startups are distinct, make sure that your startups are readable, so that, right? Because like, think about this Maple example. If these frames were frame 2, and at the first frame it looked almost identical to the idle air, you would then take that 13 frame reaction time rather, and you would have to push it forward, right? Because you wouldn't react on the first frame because you couldn't tell that the fair started. So then a lot of creators end up in this loop where they're like, well, I gave my move a bunch of startup frames, but people are complaining about readability. The problem is they don't have enough time to react because it's not the earliest frame when they're even able to react to it. A move that could otherwise have 20 startup might end up effectively having 13 because a readable frame doesn't come out until so many frames in. That's really important to know that, sure, just because your move has early startup doesn't mean that it's readable. You need to know that move's about to come out in order to be able to react to it, right? So Now we're going to talk about maybe a little bit of a more technical side, less design and more application. Hitbox logic. This is one of the more confusing parts of getting into Rivals Workshop, I think, because it's hard to find good documentation on this. Sure, you can look at Basecast, and that can get you a really good distance, but sometimes it's hard to tell what is okay and what's not, because they kind of do things in a very different way depending on the character. I agree with all of their decisions made, but it's easy to fall into that trap of like, oh, well, what am I allowed to do and what am I not allowed to do, and what are the rules? And the answer is there isn't technically rules, but there are a lot of hard things that Rivals of Aether always follows. There's a couple of, I guess that is the definition of a rule, but they like to bend it, but they don't like to break it, which is which I'll start with the active frames. So most moves in Rivals, with obvious exceptions, and you could probably think of them, have 2 to 3 frames of active frames. Most normals, I guess, is what I meant. You could look at, Claren's F tilt is a bit of a longer one. I think that one might have 4 active frames, but for the most part, moves tend to only have 2 or 3, because they're just meant to be quick. In Smash, moves tend to have way more active frames than that. So that is another important distinction, that moving into Rivals, especially if you're coming from Smash, you need to understand that it's a little bit smaller there. And I'm not sure what their balancing logic for that is. It might have something to do with parries. I don't know. But one of the most important things on this entire list, I think, is the disjoints. So the Force Burn example on the right here with the up air is what I mean when I say disjoints have a clear visual. So this move has a lot of disjoint and quite a lot of range, actually. And so a lot of people use this as an argument to like, oh, well, I can make disjointed moves. And sure, you can. But if you do make a disjointed move, remember to be like Force Burn here and show a very clear visual that demonstrates the hitbox. You know where that hitbox is just by looking at that move. If it didn't have that little smear, it would just be an invisible hitbox. It would just be an invisible disjoint. It'd be really hard to tell where it is as the player and also as the opponent to try to land that. And then I wrote this little less hitbox equals better, more consistent. Obviously, there's no there's no blanket rule for that. There are times when you want to use more hitboxes, but there's a lot of there's definitely a distinction between like way too many hitboxes, which, as you can see by that Fox example, that's the bear in the Fox's melee mode, which is activated by pressing R. I made those hitboxes to mimic what it looks like in melee. Well, that might work in melee because that game is balanced in its own way. It definitely does not work in this setting. As you can see, there's hitboxes like covering space that there's no visual for. There's way too many hitboxes when there could only just be a couple. And then the one on the bottom is the example of how you might want to do that hitbox. Draw a nice smear so you can see the visual, only maybe a front hitbox, maybe a back hitbox. Don't go crazy. You don't need 3 sections and then in those 3 sections 2 hitboxes each. You definitely do not need that. And then use the frame data doc sheet. If you don't know what that is, you can find it on almost every Rivals of Aether Discord you ever go to. But the Rivals, I believe it's from Rivals of Aether Academy. The point is, it's this big sheet that shows all of the frame data, all of the hitbox values, like all of that juicy stuff for base cast characters. If you've never looked into that and you're looking at getting into workshop character, please look into that. You can reference other similar moves. The numbers are the same. Their knockback scaling numbers are a little bit different. They multiply it by 100, but if you just divide that by 100, you can get what our appropriate values are. For instance, 500 knockback scaling would be 5 knockback scaling. Anyways, not that any move has that much knockback scaling, but yeah, please use that sheet to find good values, right? If you're like, oh, I want to make a nice horizontal sending move, don't just put in like 0 degrees because that's a horizontal number. Please look at the frame data sheet and see that, oh, all the horizontal moves in Rivals are like 361 or 40 or 45. And 361 is the angle that grounded its 40 and aerial's 45, I think. Might have mixed those numbers up. I don't remember. You can just look it up. Angles always end in a 5 or a 0. There is an exception in Basecast. And that's AESA. Her bear sends at like, I think 27.5 or something absurd like that. You shouldn't do that. Just because Basecast does it for one exception doesn't mean you should. And there's a reason they do it. It's because AESA's bear is a ridiculous move. And it can before, when the angle did end in a 5 or a 0, it led to some very bad, nasty chains with that move. And so they just adjusted it slightly just to barely make that not possible anymore. You don't have to do that. If you really, really feel like you have to, I guess you could do it for like one move, but please come up with other solutions first. That was their last resort. Please do not look at the fact that they did that and assume that's a wonderful thing that you can do, because there is a very good reason why all angles end in 5 and 0 and why they kind of have a range of angles they typically look at. So think about it like this, right? The forward facing angles and the backwards facing angles are effectively the same angle, right? It just sends you the other way. So when you DI those moves, you DI them the same way. So we can get rid of 1/2 of the full angle circle. So now there's only a half. But then the bottom half as well is pretty much never used either. There's a couple exceptions like Maple Fair, but for the most part, it's either straight down or that entire bottom section is just not used. So we can cut off most of that too. And then when you look at what remains, the top quarter of the hitbox angles is remained, and since only 5 or 0 is a valid angle, it ends up being to this point where there's only so many angles that are even in the game, right? You can only choose so many. You can choose between 90 and roughly 40, 45. Angles don't really go lower than that. Again, with exceptions like Maple Fair, unless they're a spike, which then they are between 265 and 275. They pretty much don't leave that range. And they're usually 6 base knockback. They usually don't leave that range either. So really that ends up with like, so what? 3 angles on the bottom, and then, maybe 10, 12, I probably should have counted, angles on the top, which means that you can learn reasonably to DI every single angle that you could possibly get in this game. And that's why they do that. They want consistency. They want it to not feel weird to DI these strange angle moves like 273 degrees or something. They want you to know. They want you to be able to play the game. They don't want it to be unnecessarily hard on you. So that's why they make these angles like that. It's consistency. And that applies to every character. Another important thing here, higher hit pause is definitely better. If you think, oh, maybe this move doesn't have enough hit pause, just add more hit pause. Hit pause is always good. Not only does it add to game feel and makes your attacks feel really punchy, but it also is important for DI, because then you could see you have enough time to react to the fact that you got hit by that and DI. If you don't put any hit pause on any of your moves, you just can't DI them, especially really strong moves. I also put a note here that I forgot to go over, jab 1 parry. If you look in Rivals, the jab 1 of every move is safe on parry. It should just work automatically in your Rivals character, but if you program a weird jab, you will have to fix that yourself. Just keep that in mind. Test it out. If you make a weird jab, see if it still works. And then the final thing I want to talk about is projectiles and what is transcendency. So transcendency is a state or a type rather of projectile that means you can't break it. If it comes at you and you throw a hitbox at it, it won't break. It'll just go through. Basically, this means that the only way to avoid those projectiles is physically avoiding them, jumping or parrying them. Transcendency is you got to be careful with it. Even moves like Zetaburn Fireball aren't transcendent. You have to make sure that you know what you're doing when you put those. If you don't know, like, oh, should this projectile be transcendent or not, err on the side of caution, make it not transcendent. You probably don't need transcendency in too many projectiles. There's a few cases where it is important, like say a short range projectile or something that's like, short range projectile is the best example. Something like you throw out a sword and then it comes back right to you. That's one of 2B's moves. I made that transcendent because I feel comfortable with that. It doesn't go very far. It comes back. It's basically just an extended normal. Things like that, it's safe. You can put transcendency on those, but be careful with it. Look at Basecast again. Look at the frame data doc sheet. See what moves they have that are transcendent, and try to figure out why. And if you can't figure it out, I don't know, ask somebody that's really good at the game. They could probably explain it to you. All right. Now, this is an important one because I think a lot of people forget about this. They're like about to ship out their character and then they realize, oh, I didn't put any sound effects into this, or any good sound effects anyways. There's a bit of a rule they follow here. They have 2 separate sections. Now, there are more sound effects than this, keep in mind, but these are the major ones that are used for most normals. If you want to use a funkier sound effect, you can totally go ahead. You can even use your own sound effects. Maybe try to make them not too obnoxiously loud, kind of make them fit the game. But nonetheless, these are the main. Oh, Okay, I think my mic's still working. Apologies. My headphones just died, and then they turned back on, so that's wonderful. Anyways, these are used for most normals. So you can feel safe using these for pretty close to any move. And if you do want to get more, there is a wonderful list of sound effects on the Rivals of Aether workshop manual, which I'll talk about later. So here's the differentiations, right? There's two types of moves startup noises. I actually don't know what swish is used for in the game. I've never personally used it, but it's totally there and you can use it. Swipe is the one I majorly use. There's heavy 1, heavy 2, medium 1, medium 2, weak 1, weak 2. Most moves fall under the medium category, but a few swiping noises come under the weak category. Very rarely does something come under the heavy category, but that would be something like a smash attack or a really strong special. You can feel free to use them. Don't feel afraid. If anything, I would stick to the heavier side of sound effects than the weaker side, because that's what Rivals does. They tend to stick around medium or heavy. And this is especially important in landings. The weak sound effects in landings are almost never used. Those are used for sour spots and really dinky moves. They're not really used for a normal, like unless it's a sour spot. A normal would normally have a medium sound effect or very rarely a heavy. And also try not to mix these. If you put a move landing sound effect on a move startup, for instance, it might confuse the player because they're used to hearing that move landing sound effect. So try not to mix and match them. Well, another thing I want to quickly talk about, I know there's a lot of words, but this is for if you want to go back and read the slide later. I'm just going to be very brief about it. This is the most popular workshop community that exists right now. So if you're interested in learning how to make a workshop character, if you have questions or you want to just hang out with other people that are interested in workshop, this is your go-to shop to do it. Obviously, there's places like in every region. There's even places in Alberta for talking about workshop, but this is a global community hub. If you want to check it out, you can totally feel free. They have these two processes called curation and lo-fi. Either are both equally loved. You can choose both. Curation is more if you want to take a really tight, similar to basecast character, and lo-fi is if you want still a balanced character, but you don't really care about it being exactly like basecast. If you want to go, those are tournaments. They happen very frequently. You can enter your character into those, and after some communication with the bounce guys, you can figure out how to get them into those tournament series, and get people playing your characters if you want. That is a method of doing that. And with that, it is important to talk about criticism here. Remember, criticism is two ways. You need to learn how to give criticism, and you also need to learn how to take criticism. And always remember that characters in Rivals Workshop especially are quite personal. Like remember that somebody is behind the screen that made this character and they put their blood, sweat, and tears into it. I understand you might be used to like complaining at like Sakurai or Dan Fernacey about like, his janky characters, but he's been doing this for a very long time, right? He's doing this as a job. He's getting paid for this. These workshop creators are doing this as a hobby. Please remember that it is a hobby. They're having fun. They're making their characters. Please, maybe be a little bit softer than you would have otherwise. They're not used to this. They're not professional game devs. Please try to keep it on the down low. And as well, if you're a workshop creator looking to get criticism, please please understand that you don't need your hand to be held every step. If you're animating something, you don't need to check every frame of the animation with somebody to see if it's good. You can just animate it and just send it in and then check. And I think Savvy will talk a little bit more about that. So I'll stop there. And finally, I think this is finally. Yep, it is. I want to talk briefly about the GM edit, which is probably the best IDE for making workshop characters, which is just a text editor, fancy word for it. There's also VS Code. VS Code has a dialect, which is basically it highlights things that are relevant to Rivals. But I like GM edit specifically because it was made by Yal, a dev for Rivals, and it has a really frequently updated dialect. If you were to go on the slides, which I'll link at some point, and you click on that, it does bring you straight there. And then finally, the modding manual, which is on the Rivals of Aether workshop website. If you just search Rivals of Aether and then click on the workshop tab, it takes you straight there. Please look at that. That will give you the best starting point ever. I mean, it doesn't have everything, which is why you go to these other communities like XW or whatever, DM one of us, et cetera, et cetera. But the modding manual, most of your basic questions will be answered there. You can check through it. It gives you a list of all the functions, all the variables, how to do basic things. Super, super helpful. Please check that out. Make sure that your question isn't there before you ask it. It's very easy to miss. Yeah, that's about all I have. I'm going to move it over to Savvy now.
All right, hey guys. Yo, thanks for that sick presentation, Ravyn. I feel smarter already. Let me just share my screen here and we will get started. All right, so I'm Xavier Davidson. You can call me Savvy. I'm an animator, illustrator, and game designer. My current project is a 2D hand animated platformer, and I've also got a card game coming out soon. And of course, I'm also working on a workshop character, Husk the Vengeful Fallen, because I'm cool and an edgelord like that. So, I wanted to talk today about visual design, specifically as it relates to gameplay, and then towards the end, we'll get into animation process. So, the first thing I want to touch on is the methods of character design. And one thing that people often wonder, like, okay, is it better to come up with the mechanic first and then design a character around that, or the visuals first and then the mechanics? The answer is you can do either one. They're both paths to the same central goal of creating a fantastic, wholly finished Rivals of Aether character. So top down design, that's when you go flavor first. So if Claren were designed top down, for instance, maybe it starts out, you've got this cool DeviantArt OC in your high school sketchbook. You decide, I want to put this in a fighting game. So then you go, oh, well, she's not quite cool enough. Let's make her from the future, like my favorite anime character. And, well, Trunks has a sword, so Claren can have a sword too. And now you have a cool cyberpunk panther cat sword lady, and you realize, hey, I made the tip of her sword blue. Maybe I can have a special effect when she hits just the tip of her sword. Okay, so now you've successfully designed Claren top down. Bottom up, you're going exactly the opposite direction. So you're going to start, okay, I want to make a sword character. I want to have a tipper mechanic. It's going to be awesome. But visually, how do I represent that? Okay, maybe I color the sword differently. Well, now it looks like a lightsaber. So maybe the character's from the future and its rival, so it's a cat. Okay, nice. Claren designed from the bottom up. There's a third method for which I'm a massive proponent. I think it is uber top tier, and that is player experience. A player experience is so fantastic because it does the job of both these methods because it's basically both at once. So, player experience, another word for that, gameplay fantasy. You think, what is the kernel, the central idea of the character that I'm trying to make? How am I wanting to make the player feel? Because that is the central tenet of game design. Like, you're creating an experience for the player. So, even if um, you have an idea uh, with a mechanic, or you have an idea with a character, take some time, think, what is the central idea of this character? Do I want to make the player feel like a ninja? Do I want to make them feel like this big hulking unstoppable brute? Those are really powerful ideas and they'll inform everything that you do. So, getting started with visual design. Okay, so what I did for Husk is actually an adaptation of Naruto's moveset from Super Smash Bros. 2. Really like that moveset. I wanted to play it in Rivals of Aether, and I wanted to add my own little spin on it. So Husk was designed a little bit bottom up because I had the basis of a moveset down, and a little bit top down because I knew that I wanted to create a character for whom shadow clones or something similar like that would make sense. So, looked up some reference, thought, hey, what kind of animal would work well with clones? Hey, maybe it's a bug and he uses his molts as the clones. That's the kind of thing that you can do. Find some reference, styles that you like, then put pencil to paper or mouse to screen, as it were. Now, this is really important. This step, it doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't matter at all what these drawings look like. If you've never drawn in your life before, go for it. Okay? Because first of all, the first step to being good at something is to suck at it. It's like a fighting game. You go to your first bracket, that's fine. Keep practicing, you'll get better. Same thing with drawing. But these don't have to be pretty. You're just trying to elaborate on ideas and find something that works. So this was my ideation process for Husk. I finally found something that I liked with these pink dudes down in the bottom left, and then I elaborated on that. So variation, variation, variation. Finally, with the outlined black guys you see on the left here, figured out the direction for the character. So you've got your character designed. What's next? Well, let me tell you, friends, the most important animation you will ever make, the idle pose. Now, why is idle so important? There are three reasons. First, it communicates the character's story fantasy right away. You look at Ryu, you know he's a serious guy. Okay? He's all about them fundamentals. Second, serves as a grounding point for every other animation. Every move that the character does, even an aerial, starts and ends with the idle animation. Because you're going to be in idle, you're going to jump into the air, do your move, and then you're landing, you're back in idle. This is the sun around which the planets of your animations, your attacks orbits. And finally, top tier idle animations act as wordless character tutorials because just by looking at the character, you can know instinctually how you're meant to play them. Let's go back to Street Fighter 3. Ryu, okay? He's bopping all around. He's but he's not dancing. He's just fit. He's solid. His movements are nice and precise. Okay? This guy knows what's up. He's trained every day in his life. Discipline, precision, fundamentals. You look at Hugo, you know immediately this guy is going to walk up to you, he's going to grab your head, and he's going to smash you into the ground. And whenever he's not manhandling you, he's just going to throw his whole body at you without a care in the world. Okay? And Makoto. Makoto is one of my favorite idle animations in all of gaming. I think it is uber top tier. Why is that? Let's look at her body. Her body is actually not animated at all. It is 100% still. If you look at her chest, she's not even breathing. But why is there so much tension in this animation? It's because of the angles. The back arm, the clenched fist, it's holding her back. The rest of her wants to move forward, but because there is zero motion in her body, it creates this super tension. And the movement of her clothes and hair not only brings life to the idle animation, but it also hints at the dichotomy of the character. Because Makoto is super slow in her base speed, but man, her moves are explosive. So the energy of these clothes flowing in the wind, that's hinting to the player, okay, I'm gonna move slowly if I'm not pressing buttons, but when I press buttons, I'm gonna pop off. So it makes sense when you see this slow walking animation that when you press an attack button, oh, suddenly you're zooming across the screen. And all of that is told to you through the idle animation. So if we compare Ryu and Makoto, and they have a pair of similar moves where they do an overhead attack. So Ryu, okay, he's just nice calculated strike. Okay, good technique, perfect. Makoto's trying to grind you to dust underneath her hand. And both of these animations make sense with the information that the player receives in the idle animation. It's beautiful. So, how do we go about designing an idle pose? Well, say hello to Workshop Boy. So, let's put Workshop Boy in 3 different states. I cheated a little bit with the middle one. I made him a little bit taller and his fists are bigger. But this is the basic idea where you've got a very similar character model, but based on the way you position it, you can instruct the player to play the character in different ways. So, what is this guy on the left saying? Well, all of his angles, all of his curves are pushing back. He's got his arm pointed towards his face. He's leaning back. The way that his pelvis interacts with his legs makes his feet push back as well. Everything about this character says zoner. You don't need to go in, control the pace with your projectiles, and you probably don't want to get in a scrap, but that's okay because you're going to make yourself very difficult to approach and to hit. Now, this guy in the middle, whole different story. Every line on this character is down, except that big puff in his chest, which shows that he's in power, he's in control, he is going to dominate you. He's a grounded, solid character, probably doesn't mind blocking, loves to make you block, and he's not very fast, probably going to dominate you with big hitboxes and big beefy moves. So you guys already know where this third one is going. Everything in this character screams hold forward. All of the lines, the spine is curved down, arms are bent forward. Even all the legs in these characters, they're drawn in a similar way. The curves on the one on the right are a little bit exaggerated, but it's really the position relative to the pelvis that sells these legs as moving forward. So you're going to pressure through speed, holding forward, and probably not going to have many big hits, but you are going to hit the other guy a lot. So a brief digression into what I'm calling Captain Chekhov's gun. So Chekhov's gun is a literary concept that says remove everything that has no relevance to the story. If you say in the first chapter that there's a rifle hanging on the wall, in the second or third chapter, it absolutely must go off. If it's not going to be fired, it shouldn't be hanging there. Okay, so it's a meme in the Smash community. Hey, Captain Falcon has a gun, and he never uses it. So, more often than not, when you're designing a character, you want every element to have a purpose. The thing about Captain Falcon's gun is that it actually does have a purpose. It's really cool. So, one, it has a story purpose. It lets you know that this guy is not just some racer, he's a bounty hunter too. The second really cool thing is that by not using his gun, Captain Falcon becomes a cooler character. Because, yeah, he has a gun, but he would much rather run up and knee you in the face than use his dinky little pea shooter. No, no, this guy is manliness incarnate, and he is going to Falcon punch you, he's going to knee you, and he has no need for a gun. It's just there so you know that he's not using it. So, in the same way that pose can indicate playstyle, an accessory can do the same. So, if we take this guy, fairly, standard middle of the road pose. Let's add a sword to him. Okay, so now this basically confirms that this character, he's a close quarters fighter. He has great hitboxes. He probably has more single hit moves than multi hit moves. But big chunky hits. This is this character. Now, same pose, same sword. Let's add a bunch of other swords. Suddenly, this is a completely different character. Likely, he's one of those characters who has a specific tool for every situation. He probably has some fairly unique move properties, maybe based on the weapon that he's using, and probably a lot more multi-hits than the guy on the left. Okay, so now let's take that sword and let's make it a sniper rifle. Well, suddenly, okay, this guy looks competent up close because he's not holding his rifle at the ready. But he looks competent up close up to the point where he's trying to push you out so he can skill shot you to kill. He's probably not going to kill you with a Shoryuken or a Mario F Smash. So, your character has an idle position. They're all nice and designed. How do you go about animating them? So here we've got there are 12 basic principles of animation. We're going to cover 4 today that I think are the most important to getting you started into animating your character. So Ravyn talked about and made excellent points about anticipation. Anticipation sells the beginning of your move not only to the player, but also to the opponent. Right away, you want to be in this pose that shows, yes, I pressed a button and the game recognized that I pressed that button. And not only that, but by anticipating, you're creating more space for the character's fist to travel. So the faster it looks like it's moving, the more impact it'll have. The second, we have timing. The timing is basically just deciding what to draw in each frame. Okay, so for instance, if I have an 8-frame move, am I spending 8 of those frames preparing for the strike? Am I spending 8 of those frames after the strike? Okay, that's the gist of timing. The squash and stretch, here it's a tool that you can use and that you should use most of the time to add emphasis to your character's movements, because animation is not the business of making a bunch of pretty pictures all in a row. The goal is to create the illusion of life, and squash and stretch and smear frames are really, really good at that. And we'll see more of that as we get into some animation examples. And finally, exaggeration. It's a really common technique in fighting games to stretch your character's limb out a little bit further than the main attack pose. So you can see, comparing this one in the bottom right to the one in the top right, this bottom right frame precedes the top right frame immediately. And it's stretched out just a little bit further so that it snaps into the attack and then relaxes a little bit as the character still has their arm out, because the arm out frame is the one that the player sees for more time, the exaggerated frame is the one that sells the motion. So a brief note about pixel art animation. It's a common beginner trap to fall into, where you've made your first frame, you're really proud of it, but man, I have to make 100 more frames to animate this character. I'm never going to be able to make another frame as good as this one. So they animate by shifting around the work that they've already done. And it leads to stuff like this. Not fantastic. So I'm here to encourage you, like the example before when we're designing the character, your frames don't have to be pretty at first. Polish is the last thing you do. But if you give yourself the freedom to draw each frame individually, you're going to have so much more fun, and you're going to end up with a better product. So trust me, take the time, draw your frames from scratch. Referencing the previous frame, and maybe you have your base sprite on the left so that you can keep the size consistent, but draw a rough version of every frame from scratch. So, how do you know how many frames you have to work with? Well, that's the dilemma. Well, if I animate this move and then I put it in the game and it's too long, which is more often the case. Like, oh, I animated too much startup for this. It sucks. It really has to be faster, but I'm going to lose all this work. So we don't want that. So 3-frame method for rapid prototyping and informed animation. The gist of it is this. There are 3 frames that are vital to selling an attack, and you can use those 3 frames to balance your entire move. Now, of course, if the motion is more complicated, if it's a multi-hit, or your character's jumping around doing double flips, you might need a couple more than 3. But for basic attacks, this is all you need. And the same principle applies as you get into more complicated motions. So your goal here, you want an anticipation frame, the smear and overextension frame, and the attack keyframe. You don't even need to animate the return to idle. You can just hold the attack keyframe for as long as the end lag is supposed to be. And then once you've tested your move, then you know, okay, well, the character has to get back to an idle position in, let's say, 10 frames, so I can animate 10 frames after. But this way, there's no wasted work. So even this 3-frame animation, we put it in the game. Okay, great. We can balance this. Let's say I decide that this frame should have 14 frames of startup. It'll hit on frame 15. Okay, so now I can animate informed. So for this example, we're going to animate the frames between the anticipation and the smear. So we know that we have 7 frames between those positions. Why is my math off? Rivals runs at 60 frames per second, but your average animated movie runs at 24 frames per second. You really don't need to animate a new frame for every 60th of a second. There's no point. So I usually animate at 30 frames per second. You can animate even at 15 frames per second for slower movements. So let's say we're animating at 30, which means that 14 frames of startup means that we have 7 frames between our anticipation and our smear. So the first instinct might be, well, okay, let's split these up, and I want to get from point A to point B. So let's put one pose right in the middle. Then I'll split those again, put another pose here, another pose here, and that's 3. So I have 4 left. Let's do it again, and put all these in. Okay, nice smooth motion, right? Yeah, no. So why has the animation lost all of its impact? Here's the thing. In the original version, we spent 8 frames only on the anticipation, and then immediately the character snaps into the smear, and that is where the impact of the move is generated. Here, the frame directly preceding the smear is just, there's barely any movement here. So what that ends up doing is it removes all of the impact from the move. So we don't want the 3-frame version because it's lacking a little bit of life. So what can we do instead? Let's instead emphasize this anticipation frame and have him lean deeper into it. This is even fewer frames of animation than the smooth version. We're going to hold these for 2 each. So 2 frames, 2 frames, 2 frames, and then our last frame will smear into the, or sorry, squash and stretch into the smear, and bam, so much more power because we're actually letting our character sit in that anticipation. All right. So brief side note, going back to Street Fighter 3 for a second. The way that your character does a move has a large impact on how they're read. So here we have Ryu doing, I think it's his standing hard punch, the haymaker move. And here's Hugo doing a similar move. So the way that these characters do these moves tells you so much about them. Like we were talking about earlier with the idle pose, Ryu is strong, he's disciplined, he has great technique. Hugo is just a crazy meat mountain, and he's throwing his entire body into every move. So you can, by using the 3-frame method, you can experiment with different ways of portraying your character really quickly and figure out which one works best in game. So for instance, if we go with the big brute version of Workshop Boy, this one on the left, if we're trying to throw this, like say it's a slow moving projectile, right? So this one, he looks super superior, he's in control, he's smarter than you, and his body is perfect. This one on the right is much more like Hulk out, lose control, super savage mode, right? And both of these work for the character, but thanks to the 3-frame method, with a very minimal amount of work, you can decide which version of the character you want to pursue. Okay, so finally, we're going to talk about secondary motion, a 5th principle of animation for you guys today. So the way I animate the character first, and I ignore the secondary elements like hair, clothing, because all of those don't move by themselves. Their motion is informed by the character that they're on. So that's what secondary motion is. It's elements that don't move by themselves, but are instead moved by other elements. So to demonstrate that, let's give Workshop Boy a pompadour. So as he goes back into this animation, because the pompadour isn't moving by itself, it's going to lag behind his motion. And as he moves back, it'll be dragging, and then when he changes direction, it's still going to be going in the first direction until it gets pulled back again. So let's watch it in slow motion. So here, gets pulled back, overshoots a little bit, and then bounces back into the final pose. Again, perfect. So at full speed, that's a nice little touch to add some more life to the animation. And this is super, super useful when you're dealing with moves that have to have extremely fast startup. So let's say instead of 14 frames, this move has like 3 frames of startup, okay? So how are we going to sell this? We don't have a lot of time to spend in anticipation, but we do have some time at the end of the move, and that's when secondary motion comes in. So we can add life to the end of that move just by animating the secondary elements. Now, there's one word of caution when you're dealing with secondary elements. Be careful how they impact your character's silhouette. So this is a rough version of Husk's back air. And in the version on the left here, the move read fine in the game when it didn't have the scarf. When I added the scarf in this version, you can see here, I completely shattered the silhouette, and this scarf is competing for attention with the arm. So that's something you want to be careful of. You want to put the emphasis where your hitbox is. So this move on the left was confusing. Then I redid it. On the right, I tucked the scarf in a little bit more, so the emphasis of the animation is on the spot where it's hitting. And that is super important. So that's it for me today. There's some amazing resources out there. The Game Boy Advance Fire Emblem games are fantastic to look at to study this idea of 3 basic frames in their animation, because they basically build all of their hit animations around anticipation, a smear, a hit, and then a return to idle frame. And everything else mostly is secondary motion that's selling the rest. So these slides will be available after. You can check out these links. There's the Street Fighter 3 animation library. Art Eater is a fantastic Twitter channel that analyzes animation. There's a GDC talk by the lead animator for Skullgirls, which is fantastic, relates specifically to animating for fighting games. And then New Frame Plus, general animation advice. And Krita is the software that I use. So you can join in there for some free painting, pixel art, and animation software. So that's it from me. I think we have a couple minutes to take some questions from chat.
Yeah, question time. Woo! Amazing job, by the way, Savvy. That was very excellent.
Thank you, Ravyn.
God, nice plug in your Twitch. Got it.
Oh, yeah. Stream every day, Monday to Friday.
I like how my Twitter is not on the stream. That's great. At
Ravyn, wait a second.
Whoa. Who said that?
Oh, yeah, your Twitter should be on the stream. Oops.
At Ravyn Hardcastle, spelled the same as my name. It's fine. How can I? Yeah, Savvy, that one's gonna be for you. How can I be as cool as you? You're gonna want to answer that.
Ooh, drink lots of water.
This is true, actually. You should drink lots of water.
I actually don't drink enough water. So if you want to be cooler than me, drink a lot of water.
I heard you taking a swig of water, unless I'm just seeing things.
Yeah,
What's your favorite Fire Emblem animation? I like Roy's critical animation.
Let's see. I think Lynn's critical animation is really cool. I might have to go with that one.
Yeah, there's a workshop character made with that animation.
Yeah, you're telling me about that. That is so cool.
Yeah, if you look up Lynn in the Rivals of Aether workshop, you do indeed see a character made almost entirely out of Lynn's critical animation from her game.
Favorite Third Strike character? It's got to be Makoto.
Yeah.
You can probably tell because I used her as my main example, but oh man, she is so good. She demonstrates like every principle of animation perfectly. It's amazing. Most BS hitbox you've ever seen? What do you think, Ravyn?
What, in workshop or in base Rivals? Because I can answer both.
In general, let's say.
I think in general, I can say this because he's my friend, but Kid Goku and Krillin, old characters, they've been since improved, but back in the day, they used to have ridiculous disjoints with no visuals on them. Back when Workshop was the Wild West, like he used to have a bear, and the bear hitbox itself was bigger than his entire body, and there was no visual for it. It was very good. The Wild West days are excellent. Miss those days.
Yeah, I think mine would have to be Ori down smash, or specifically Ori team down smash. That move is silly. There are other crazier examples out there, but that is the one that broke me. Ori down smash.
If you want to look at examples of how not to do stuff, recently a bunch of characters creators are uploading their old versions of their characters to the workshop, and you could look at our humble beginnings.
Nice.
Worst, most jank animation. I mean, I'm not going to answer with an actual workshop thing because that's probably rude. Not that I can even think of one off the top of my head, to be honest. But I can tell you that Forceburn's some before maybe not Forceburn actually. His weren't too bad. You know, old Craig animations, they improved them vastly. Very good now. I can say that one because they improved it. Or the old Dan animations too.
For me, it's Wei Shan up air from Icons. If you guys can look that move up, you're in for a treat. Anyway, we have to wrap it up there, guys. But we're both on Twitter. I'm at Savier, and Ravyn is at Ravyn Hardcastle, I believe. If you want to continue to ask us some questions, so enjoy the rest of the conference, and we'll see you later.
See ya.